Good morning. Welcome everybody, and special in particular welcome to our distinguished invited speakers, Dale Stephens and David White. I should begin from David White and saying that he's Director of Education, former Director of Education Policy in European Commission, visiting Fellow of the European University of Florence, and now a student of Catholic University of Louvain. And I should say also that this is the first time that a former director, is speaking now as a student, in particular as a student of theology. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation to be with us today. And now, Dale is missing. Dale Stephens. Dale Stephens is Finnish, is preparing his book named Hacking Your Education. He wants to share with us a particular vision of education, what should be education now and in the future. He's founder of a particular movement and college. It's okay? And I think that we are in a very particular moment. We are living a very particular moment this morning. You're going to experience the thinking of two distinguished invited speakers. They are thinking education as a relational condition, movement, something that is the condition of the society also, the organization of the networked society. And this concession of education, for instance, from David, is something that experienced the thinking of our traditional teachers, but more of that experience, that kind of experience is reconfiguring the digital society, is the possibility that we have to make the digital narratives of the digital society. We are facing network society, we are facing network-based knowledge, we are working in a collaborative based society, we are promoting collaborative learning, we are living collaborative learning. So I think that our experience should be more than thinking about school. Maybe traditionally we think that school, it was a very important time in our lives. The question now is that school is no longer a time in our lives. We and school should be together to a different condition of living. Not as a school, a formal school, not as a different space. Maybe you will explain better these visions. But as a different process, a different narrative to experience the knowledge and to produce and to develop knowledge, not closed in the schools, but in the world. Well, I will invite first Dale Stephens. I will follow this indication. I will invite first Dale Stephens.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here in Porto. It's fun to take a weekend off, though it was a long flight from San Francisco. You're probably wondering why some guy who looks like your son is standing on stage in front of you. And the reason is because I left school at a very young age. I left school when I was 12, to be exact, and spent years directing my own education. And I just finished my first book for Penguin, which is called Hacking Your Education, which is about that journey. It'll be published early next year. And I run an organization called Uncollege, which supports self-directed learners as they go about figuring out how to direct their own education. But the story of how I became a published author and got into revolutionizing education starts nearly 30 years ago. In the early 1980s, my mom got her teaching credential at Sonoma State University. And after she finished her degree, she spent almost 10 years teaching in public schools. But by the time I arrived, her views on school and society had changed quite a bit since the time that she entered university. I recall happy days spent in kindergarten, playing in the sandbox. First grade was largely enjoyable for me. I enjoyed going to school and interacting with my friends. It was still fun. But I had a stickler for a teacher. She wouldn't let me read chapter books and insisted that I keep on reading books that were at the first grade level, which just didn't make any sense to me. If I was reading at a faster level, why couldn't I just go ahead? Second grade was slightly better, but my teacher kept insisting that my parents were helping me become too educated and suggested that they stop taking me to museums because I might learn too much. And so by the end of third grade, I was getting really pretty frustrated with the school system as it was. I'd been put with a teacher who was trying her best to adapt to my learning style, but really wasn't doing too well when she had 30 kids in the classroom. When we tried to talk to my teacher, my principal, into changing classes, she was not at all amenable to the idea. And I ended up leaving school, public school in third grade, for a small private school. And the private school didn't go very well in fourth grade. It became very religious, and that's not at all the sort of schooling experience that I wanted. And I told my parents at the end of that year that I didn't want to go to school. And they said, well, hey, it's your life. We're not going to make you go to school. The worst thing that can possibly happen is that you go back to school. School's always going to be there. And so fifth grade, when I was 11, was my last year in school. We fought for more than half the year to try and get me into a more advanced math class. And when that battle was finally won, school got a little bit better, but not that much. And by the end of the year, it felt like more time was spent dealing with kids who were misbehaving than actually learning. All the time and the time that was spent actually learning was focused on trying to complete standardized tests, where in California, any focus on math or arts or science or anything interesting had been totally scrapped from the budget. And so when I left school, my parents were a little bit worried and spent many sleepless nights wondering about whether I would survive outside of school or not as an unschooler. And I became an unschooler, which is a self-directed form of homeschooling. When I left school in sixth grade, no one asked any questions. My mom, who was a classically trained teacher, tells me that the first day she tried to get me to follow a very strict curriculum, where we'd sit down for 4 hours and learn for 4 hours, as the state-mandated homeschoolers should do. And that just didn't work. On the first day of homeschooling, I told my mom that I learned more in that one day than I had in an entire year of fifth grade. We tried to repeat that, but it just didn't work. What was the point of leaving school if you're just going to replicate school at home? I didn't leave school to just sit at my kitchen table and do dittos and worksheets all day. And then I spotted an ad in our local newspaper for a not back to school night hosted by some local unschoolers. These unschoolers introduced me and my parents to books by John Holt, John Taylor Gatto, and even Illich, luminaries of the unschooling movement. The parents were kind and curious, the kids were creative and free, and were an example of how learning outside of school could work as a system. those families passed on a framework and a vocabulary for an educational philosophy that I and my parents were still very much trying to wrap our heads around. After all, my mom was a teacher. She'd worked in schools for 10 years, and my dad was an engineer, quite the product of the system. They'd both been invested in the school system. The school system had actually worked particularly well for them. They'd both gone to well-funded public schools and felt that the schools had served them well. My mom, in particular, who'd come from a poor home with an alcoholic father, had been well served by her public school and was the only student in her family to go to college. So for her, the idea of leaving school, which had been a safe haven, a social elevator, an instrumental force in her life, seemed really bizarre. So unlike the vast majority of my peers, I worked when I felt like it and never knew what day of the week it was. I pursued projects that I was interested in. I wasn't tested, graded, or told to memorize facts and dates just because. Instead, I completed self-evaluations and real-world projects that demonstrated my knowledge. I was, in effect, an unschooler. In the decade before my mom enrolled in Teachers College, books about alternative education were wide in circulation. The most famous was A.S. Neil's Summer Hill, about the alternative democratic boarding school that he started in the UK, which sold more than 3 million copies between 1960 and 1973. That's an astronomical number. The average book sells like 4,000 copies or something. Selling 3 million in 13 years is hitting it out of the park. There were also John Holt's How Children Learn and How Children Fail, Jonathan Kozol's Death at an Early Age, Carl Rogers' Freedom to Learn, George Dennison's The Lives of Children, and even Illich's Deschooling Society, to name the few most influential books that helped frame this philosophy. In the early 1970s, Growing Without Schooling, the magazine that John Holt started about unschooling, which was published well into the 1990s, was delivered to your mailbox in a brown paper bag, as though you might not want your neighbors to know what you were engaging in. And this magazine, Growing Without Schooling, started the first community around unschooling and got people together and working together in learning outside of school, so that if people left school, they weren't just autonomous units, but could actually become part of a community of unschoolers, could organize collaborative classes, and engage with a community in much the same way that you could in a traditional institution. The publications like Growing Without Schooling about alternative education were part of a top-to-bottom movement to reinvent education. There were freedom schools that had been part of the civil rights movement. There were free schools founded on the idea that the world should be committed to child-centric and democratic education. Then came widespread campus unrest against the corporate multiversity, which was part of the movement against the Vietnam War and culminated in mass student movements in the 1970s. My point in explaining all this is that too often when I talk to people about reforming education, I think this is particularly true in Silicon Valley, they think that they've come up with new ideas. And that's just not true. So much of what's actually made possible now was actually thought up 30 or 40 years ago. And people fail to recognize that there are no new ideas. There are new ways to implement them, but there are no new ideas. Today, the prospect of the popularity of a book like Summer Hill, which describes an anti-authoritarian school where the students hire their own teachers, seems kind of absurd. Instead, we get books like How to Do Well in the SATs, encouraging students to figure out how to game the system, to get to the top of this meritocracy, which seems pretty meaningless to me. Studies about how to do well on the SAT and countless other books criticize our emphasis on testing, tracking, and placement. They question why we insist on enriching kids like their bags of flour with our single-minded obsession of getting to the top of that meritocracy, getting into the best college, getting the A, no matter how meaningless that meritocracy is to begin with. But in the end, they make no argument or suggestion of any other way we could live and learn. They say, oh, you could do SAT prep classes. Maybe you could enroll in more extracurricular activities. You could do some more dittos to up your math facts. And maybe we should put technology in classrooms and give people iPads, people are saying now. But those are all very superficial solutions. They don't seem like they get to the root of the problem, which is that we are so entrenched in the idea that education is limited to school. My question is this. Why are we even thinking about reforming school? Shouldn't the question be about how do we revolutionize education, whether that's in or outside of school? When I was young, I thought homeschooling was weird. I rightly assumed, like many people, that homeschoolers were wacko religious people who didn't want their kids to learn about evolution. And certainly that is a brand of homeschooling in the US, but it's not the brand of homeschooling that I engaged in. The brand of homeschooling that I engaged in were unschoolers. These are people who were choosing to leave school for academic or intellectual reasons, who'd left school for a conscious purpose because they thought that they could get a better education outside school than they could inside the classroom. Unlike homeschoolers, unschoolers don't try and limit their worldview. They try and expand it. In theory, when I was an unschooler, the world was my classroom. We wouldn't sit down for 6 hours and do worksheets. Instead, we'd go outside and play and find some frogs in the creek and go on a Wikipedia hunt and figure out how to learn. If we were fascinated by photography or what was outside of us, we were able to engage in what we were doing. And really, what the question this comes down to is, do we trust people's innate capacity to be curious? Do we trust that people have interests? Or do we think that they need to be tested and guided and formed and molded? The older I get, the more amazing it is to me that my parents had such trust in me when I was so young. But then I think, have you ever met someone who isn't interested in something? Sometimes people's interests aren't interesting to you, but that's an entirely different problem. Have you ever met someone incapable of learning? After all, we don't take babies to speaking or walking classes, and we all seem to have turned out just fine. And that's where we all start. One of the biggest benefits of unschooling was that my curiosity wasn't limited by 50-minute blocks with ringing bells. Sometimes projects lasted an hour, sometimes weeks, months, or years. Some of the things that I engaged in as an unschooler were doing things like working on political campaigns. I organized collaborative learning groups with other unschoolers. This is an example of a music group. I helped build a library in my hometown. I went to conferences. I worked at startups. I took 6 months and I lived in France. And was able to engage with my education in a way that I never would have been able to inside the classroom. I set my own standards of excellence, which were often impossible to meet. Yet failure at academic or intellectual or creative goals that I set for myself never seemed humiliating. There was no one lording a position of right answers over me who was going to smack me if I was wrong. Instead, I was surrounded by people like my parents, mentors, and peers who were instead asking, how can we help you? What other questions do you have? Have you considered this possibility? Unschooling seemed to have worked for me, and for about the 25 other unschooling peers that I had, people who I engaged with in collaborative classes. We had park days together, we took field trips together. So it's very much that I had a community of my own, much like in school, but this community existed outside of it. And for the 25 of us, it seems to have worked. We're all literate. We can balance the checkbook. We're living independently. And we've all had the chance to pursue higher education, though not all of us have stayed. And I really don't think that we're exceptions. Even the mainstream has been forced to acknowledge that kids schooled at home or outside the classroom do better on standardized tests, were typically more creative, marvelously well-behaved, and get along with people of all ages. And in fact, Ivy League universities have begun to hunt down homeschoolers and unschoolers, particularly for these traits. If you go on the college admissions website of Stanford or Princeton or Harvard, you'll find pages dedicated specifically to recruiting homeschoolers and unschoolers. We're just the type of motivated students that universities want. And even though I spent 6 years outside of the classroom engaging in and directing my own education, I still assumed that I'd go to university. Partially because I justified my choice to leave school by saying, oh, my friend Sarah was unschooled, and she got into Harvard, so it must be okay. And it's pretty funny that I thought to justify my choice to leave school by the fact that I would have a better chance to get into higher education. I should make it clear that we unschoolers all at one time or another tried out various elements of school. For example, I took a chemistry course when I couldn't find Bunsen burners in my kitchen, and I did attend traditional schools from kindergarten until 6th grade. I experienced the trifling emotions associated with immaturity, the greed, the envy, the fear, the conformity, and I just didn't fit in. Mostly, I was bored by the 35% of the time that the teacher spent doing classroom control instead of actually learning. I'd sit at my desk and make notes about what I really wanted to learn, and when I got home, I'd sit down with a book and read, finally getting to engage. Boredom is what I was really released from when I left school. Everyone knows that school is about the management of knowledge in theory. And on one hand, it acclimates children to clerical work so that the mind-numbing hours of clerical, boring work are less mind-numbing as an adult. But on the other hand, schooling calculates boredom as an attitude, a habit, a way of being, sort of a passive form of an existence. I'm always stunned when I engage with people, much like I did at college, who say, weren't you bored at home? Don't you recall being in school? Schools are lethargic factories, home to monotony. Think of the pencil chewing, the passing of notes, the ways that you tried to get the day to go a little bit faster. Looking busy when you're about to doze off, staring longingly out the window, thinking about what could happen outside. For me, boredom presented an opportunity to explore. When I was bored, I'd try something new. I could always head down to the library or pick up a new book, go on Wikipedia, or start an encyclopedia hunt. As an only child with fairly traditional parents, I always assumed that I'd go back to high school once I originally left school. But when I got to 10th or 11th grade, there I was 16 or 17, and realizing that I hadn't actually gone back to high school, I was still outside of school. And I started to wonder, and my parents started to wonder, what doors would be closed to me if I didn't go back to school, didn't go back to university, didn't get a college degree? I started to wonder, could I even get into a good university? And so I started working at a company called Zinch, which is this pictured here. And Zinch actually helps people get into college. And I worked there for 6 months before I went to college and had a great time. I learned a lot in the process, but also learned something about the irony of Zinch, which is that 3 of the people in this photo who founded Zinch, a company that helps people get into college, dropped out of college themselves. And I began to realize that maybe going to college wasn't the end-all, be-all in life. Maybe I could do what I wanted, maybe I could engage, and maybe I could lead a happy, productive life and contribute to society in a positive way without necessarily having a college degree. And so before I went to college, Mick, who's on the right of this picture, tried to convince me not to go. He said, hey, you've got a great job, you're doing awesome work, I think you should stay. And I said, well, I think I should at least try university, and if I don't like it, I'll come back. So that's what I did. And when I left Zinch, I was tasked with hiring a replacement. And the guy that I ended up hiring to do my job had just finished Harvard Business School. And when I got to university on my first week of orientation, I started thinking, why did I go to university when I just left a job where the person who replaced me had a master's degree? It just didn't make sense. So at Hendrix, the small private liberal arts school in Arkansas that I attended, I thought that I would find engaged students. There were smart students there who cared about learning, but to a large extent, they didn't know how to translate what they were doing in the classroom to what they were doing in the real world. When I got to college, I assumed that students would be envious of my upbringing, but most were aghast by the idea of unschooling. I wouldn't know what to do with myself all day at home, they'd say, or I wouldn't want my mom as a teacher. A handful of friends got it immediately. They were the ones failing classes because they were trying to cultivate the spirit in school and the same experience in school that I'd had at home. Over the course of the 8 months that I was enrolled in college, I read fewer books than in the month of unschooling before I enrolled. For me, school was a sociological experiment. When I was bored in class, I'd take notes about how the professors and students were interacting, how it was a routine and existential judgment, how the lessons of mechanism and routine were thrust upon students. The academics were an absolute breeze. I realized that I'd been working harder than most people in school all along, exactly the opposite of what I believed. This is only because now I had clearer metrics for success. There was a certain pleasure, I confess, in knowing how I was doing, in knowing, in handing over the responsibility of my success to the system, and knowing exactly how I was doing in relation to other people. I got kudos daily for my thinking and work, and like all the students, I came to see myself reflected in the marks that I got. I got top marks and eventually became disinterested in school. The first day at university, they sat us down, and at convocation, the faculty and administrators sat us down and said, "You are here because you are the best. This is the place to be, and you are the smartest and brightest lights of your generation." And my heart sank because I knew that wasn't true. We were there, we were in university, we'd gone there because we were darlings of the system. We'd accepted the gains of the system in exchange for sacrificing our freedom to learn. We'd jumped through hoops and checked boxes, we'd done well on the SATs, and we'd completed all the extracurricular activities that the admissions office asked for. As the semester continued, I felt more and more alone in school than I ever had as an unschooler, even though I now had 2,000 students around me. One miserable afternoon in January, I was complaining of my loneliness to a friend who was also unschooled, who'd gone to Dartmouth, one of the Ivy League schools, and left because of a similar disillusionment that I felt with college. University, she likes to say in the brightest tone possible, is awesome for people who like small, isolated environments. And as I expressed my frustration to Becca, she asked, "Have you ever seen the movie Accepted?" Accepted is this movie is about a bunch of kids who are rejected from college and instead decide to go form their own college. They commandeer a school, they take it over, and they start organizing collaborative learning groups. They create their own majors and are able to engage in a way that they never would have in university. They created a form of an unschooler university. Why then, Becca asked, couldn't we do the same? And I said that was crazy. Perhaps we could start by improving things. Maybe we could start a conference or write a book about how to change the system. And a few days later, after having this conversation, I realized that I was still thinking within the confines of the system. Even in the 8 months I'd spent in school, those 8 months had bounded my thinking to think that starting something new would be too big. And I realized I didn't have to change the system. I could work outside of it. And last January, I registered uncollege.org, and in April, I left university for good. I haven't been back. In starting Uncollege, I realized that unschooling is not something you do until you're 18 and then you enroll in college and start a career. It's a lifelong commitment, an ethos sort of the way boredom can be, but boredom's opposite. It's a commitment to being engaged, to being present, to being directed, to actively making your own choices, to being an independent critical thinker about what you want to do with your own life and what you're interested in. What I realized is that we live in a democracy, yet we learn in a dictatorship. Often when I talk to people about these issues, they say, admit that unschooling worked for you, but it can't work for everyone. It's a common and troubling response. On one hand, it's a compliment. In the parlance of public school, it's to say, I'm gifted, I'm exceptional. On the other hand, it implies that most people need to be tested and guided and molded and standardized and mechanized in the way that school does. But what makes us so sure that most people couldn't handle self-education? John Taylor Gatto, the noted education critic, put it this way: after a long life and 30 years in public schools, I've concluded that genius is as common as dirt. We suppress genius only because we haven't figured out how to manage a population of educated men and women. And in fact, studies done in both the US and the UK find that children who learn outside of school actually do better than children who learn in school, even in light of factors that traditionally affect success inside school. Factors like race, socioeconomic level, parents' education level, and the amount of money spent on school. One study in the UK found that working-class children learning outside of school outperformed upper-class children learning in school. Studies like this make you think that there might be something to this self-directed education thing. Maybe it's not just something for upper-class kids who are intelligent and motivated, but perhaps instead self-directed education is something that we could all potentially engage in. Many people, both liberal and conservative alike, are often deeply offended by critiques of compulsory schooling, and understandably so. Every day we're told that school holds the key to success, that the proper credentials will allow marginalized people to rise in society, and school has become this form of social equalizer. And for people like my mom, this was absolutely the case. As I mentioned, she grew up in a fairly destitute family and ended up going to college, to Duke, a Southern Ivy, and continued to get a teaching degree. But the question that led her to first question schools was, are schools actually social levelers? Or do they in fact reinforce the class pyramid by tracking and sorting children from a young age? As a young teacher, my mom moved to the Central Valley of California and taught in fairly underfunded public schools with large Hispanic populations. And she was really troubled by the fact that the schools that she was in the schools and communities that she worked in, the people who were getting the most funding, the most attention, were the people who were English speakers already, who were in the least need of support, but were getting all the attention. And she thought, how can this be fair? School was just simply reinforcing the existing caste system that it was supposed to equalize. Given that ideal, she was uncertain about unschooling, but ultimately thought that I should make my own decision. She thought that forcing me to agree with her worldview would be exactly against her idea of what it meant to be an independent critical thinker. So growing up, I experienced unschooling as a compromise, the more appealing of two extremes in the rural farm town that I called home. One, not going to school and directing my own education, or going to school and having my spirit absolutely crushed. My argument today is not against school as a system, but a bold cry in favor of options. I believe that we should give everyone the choice of how they want to learn. In his 2008 book, Predictably Irrational, Dan Ariely explains how the design of the decision process to opt in or opt out of organ donor forms in different European countries affects people's choices. In those countries where the people had to opt in, the percentage of organ donors was extremely low. On the other hand, in the countries where people had to opt out, the number of people who chose to become organ donors was almost 100%. The lesson here, Ariely says, is that people resort to default choices when the factors of the decisions are too complex. I believe that education nowadays is in a similar design situation. The path is so complex, with so many factors and options, that it's easier to resort to the default than go through the tough process of understanding that there are other paths out there. However, the issue needs to be tackled with more severity in the case of college, in the case of school. Fewer organ donors is definitely a bad thing, but not as bad as countless people with thousands of dollars in debt and trouble finding work because of the commoditization of the value of school. The real issue with school is that the trade-offs are too big and the return too vague to let it be our only choice. It's a default status that we need to shatter. Let's keep school, but only as another option. This is the thought process that I and many other education activists are focusing on as we go about designing solutions outside of school. We need to make it clear. We need to make the decision process easier, remove the fog that encourages people to resort to the defaults. In an unpredictable professional world where the economy is tight, it's only through customization that people will rise to the challenge. The sad fact is that we're paying too much for university and learning too little. The cost of college is rising in America and also abroad. More than 350% since 1980. More than any other real good in the U.S. economy. More than medical care, more than housing, more than transportation. It's astronomical. And the problem is not limited to the U.S. The UK recently tripled tuition fees, and it's hard to imagine that other places won't soon follow suit. Quebec, for example, right now is overtaken by student protests. The average student in the U.S. graduates with $27,000 in debt. And I say this not to scare you, nor to focus the situation too much on America, but because this is a reality. And with 19 million college students in the U.S., that makes more student debt than credit card debt. It means that there's more than $1 trillion in student debt. And what's really, really scary about this is that the bankruptcy laws in the U.S. were amended in 2005. And that means that student loan debt is now unforgivable in the case of bankruptcy. So that means that you can foreclose on your house, which is what happened in 2008. You can have the bank repossess your house. But you cannot go bankrupt on your education. Your student loans are going to stay with you until you die. Which is really, really scary and means that we're probably facing a bubble that's as bad, if not worse, than the housing bubble, simply because student loans are not subject to bankruptcy laws. But not only is the cost rising astronomically, and the economics of the situation are a problem in and of themselves, but the actual value of education is declining too. The New York Times recently called those under 25 who have recently been through college, who should be the beneficiaries of the most recent advancements in pedagogical and educational technology, as Generation Limbo. 22.5% of those under 25 in the U.S. with college degrees are unemployed. Another 22% are unemployed who've graduated from Yale with English degrees and are working jobs as bartenders, collecting welfare checks to pay rent. Another problem is rampant grade inflation. In 1940, just 15% of grades handed out at universities were A's. Today, more than 40% are. I'd like to think that we're all getting smarter, but I don't think that's the case. Academically Adrift, a study done at NYU last year, found that 36% of college students, as measured on the Collegiate Learning Assessment, showed no improvement in critical thinking, complex reasoning, or writing, even after 4 years of college. These are some of the figures that led me to question university. And I don't want to spend too long dwelling on these because you can look these up. They're facts, they're realities that we have to deal with. What's more exciting is to talk about the future going forward. For me, what I found at college was that life was at parties. This is a game played in the U.S. called beer pong, and you fill all these cups on the table with beer, and you try and throw a ping pong ball down to the end of the table, and if you get the ping pong ball in the cup, you have to take a shot of beer. Which, for college students in Arkansas, was apparently highly amusing. I never quite got this game. But it seemed as though people were not at college to learn. They were there for the social experience. About a week before I left college, I was sitting in the cafeteria with my peers, and they started asking me serious questions about what I was going to do when I left school. I said, where are you going to live? How are you going to support yourself? But the best question of all, asked with complete and utter sincerity, was, aren't you going to miss the beer and the girls? And I was flabbergasted for a moment, not because this young man was interested in the beer and the girls at college. It seems like a pretty common thing for people to be interested in, getting drunk and having sex at college. But rather that he didn't understand that those are things that you can do outside university too. Those are not things that are limited to the college experience. And once I collected myself, I responded, I prefer guys and champagne, and I think I'm going to find more of that in San Francisco than I ever will in Arkansas. And I moved back to San Francisco later on that month and started working on my book called Hacking Your Education. And in writing the book, I've concluded that we live in a pretty fucked up world where we expect people who are 12-year-olds to decide what to do with the rest of their lives when they enroll in AP classes or start doing SAT prep. What if you arrive at university like my friend Sandeep, devoted to pre-med with parents who are pushing him in that direction, only to discover that you want to build mobile applications? That's really, really scary. And of course, given your intellect and your discipline, you can pound your square peg into the round hole of medical school. And society has a plethora of resources to support you in doing that. To ease your grief, we offer alcohol, television, divorce, Walmart, and more. But education shouldn't be about society's needs. University should be about figuring out what you like and what you love to do. The book builds on my story as an unschooler, but more importantly, shares the stories of about 50 people that I interviewed who've done interesting things with their lives without relying on formal education. Some of them have college degrees, some of them don't, some of them never went to college at all. But the common thread between everyone that I interviewed is this. They understood that they have agency. They started to make their own decisions, and they didn't wait for anyone to give them permission. What they do professionally, they picked up along the way. They took night classes. They found mentors. They learned on their job. Their education was fragmented in a way. It was decentralized. And that's what's happening right now. Education is becoming decentralized. I say that not in some sort of futuristic, this will happen in 10 years way, but as a statement of fact. The disaggregation of education is happening right now all around us. There are people all over the world, many in Silicon Valley where I live, whose primary goal is to make school irrelevant. When I think about the revolution in education, instead of asking, how do we change school, I take a step back and ask, what does school provide? What are the primary functions of school? What's the purpose of going there? And for me, the answer is threefold. First, school provides knowledge. The other two, which I'll get to in a moment, are community and signal. But first, I want to run down a few of the initiatives, the applications, the companies that are working on disaggregating the function of knowledge in an institution. For years, universities had a hold on knowledge. First it was libraries, then it was professors who would dictate knowledge to you. And that all began to change about 10 years ago with things like OpenCourseWare, right? And OpenCourseWare has now been around for, 12 years, 13 years. And as an unschooler, OpenCourseWare was extremely useful. It was awesome to have all of Harvard and MIT's classes online for free. But now people are taking that to the next level. Things like TED are breaking down knowledge into bite-sized bits. The Khan Academy is doing the same thing and organizing knowledge. We have free textbooks from sites like library.nu. Question and answer sites like Quora, for example, are enabling people to find answers to their questions from the crowd. Inkling is doing the same thing for textbooks that iTunes did for albums. Now you can purchase just chapters of a textbook instead of purchasing the entire textbook. And companies like Udacity are taking completely different approaches, going completely outside of the university track, taking tenured professors at universities, encouraging them to leave school and teach online. The second part of school is the community, the people who are around you, who are there to challenge and engage you, as well as the people who are there 20 years down the line, who are there to support you as a network. This function of school is also becoming disaggregated. We have sites like studentmentor.org to help you find mentors outside of school. Courses like Udemy that allow anyone to create and share their knowledge. Companies like Skillshare that are bringing learning communities into the real world. On Skillshare, anyone can create and teach a course in the real world. Companies like OpenStudy that are using Facebook and the social graph to find people all around the world who are working on the same problems, who can provide support as you go about working on your homework or finding the answers to big challenges. Companies like HootMe that are switching Facebook into study mode and, again, providing ways for you to use your social network to gain knowledge. Sites like Piazza that are operating within college classes, but then making that knowledge publicly available for anyone to find. Piazza is a question and answer site that's used within university courses, yet when that knowledge is uploaded onto the site, it's available for anyone to see and use. Companies like CourseKit, a learning management system based in New York that's being used by professors all around the world, that as a condition of use, the knowledge that's put on CourseKit is free and openly available. Anyone can log on to any course that's being taught on CourseKit, can see the content, can get support from the instructors, can take the exams, and emerge with a certificate. Companies like TechShop that are operating real-world laboratories that are furthering the notion of school being like a gym. You can buy a membership to TechShop and go and use the university or the laboratory as you want, and go and find those Bunsen burners or welders. And companies like General Assembly, based in New York, which is already expanding to London and Berlin, as well as to San Francisco and Los Angeles. That's a new take on an incubator, which incubates companies but also provides education. General Assembly very much thinks of themselves as an education company. They call their locations campuses, and is just one example of how cities are being transformed into universities. And the last part is the signal. The college degree that says that you are a qualified individual who is ready to contribute to society. It says that you can complete a certain amount of work, that you can do a certain amount, and that you are ready to be a productive employee. This is being disaggregated by sites like Behance, where Fortune 500 companies are hiring creative professionals off the internet. Companies like Stack Overflow or GitHub, where the same thing is happening for people with technical skills who can code. No longer do they need to go to college. They upload their code onto GitHub or Stack Overflow, contribute to the community, and people are hiring with careers right off of those websites. There are also interesting takes on how to make a college degree more affordable. Companies like Straighter Line are doing this, where you can get a college degree for about $500 from an accredited institution. Western Governors University is pioneering competency-based degrees. You can go in on day one and pass the exam, and if you pass the exam, you've passed the course. Companies like AssetMap that are disaggregating the function of having Harvard alumni networks, where you can use your existing social network to find people who complement your skill set, who you want to get to know. You can find all of this and more. I realize I ran through this very quickly at uncollege.org. We provide a comprehensive list of resources broken down into those categories. But the point that I want to make is this, that today, instead of having to buy a one-size-fits-all education solution from a school or a university, you can choose the pieces of an education that fit you best. For example, maybe a student would take some courses from MIT, join a local co-working space to find a community, use Twitter to build a network, and be accepted as part of a fellowship program or go through a certificate program at General Assembly instead of getting a college degree. Everyone will be curating their education like this in 10 years. It costs 1/10 of the price of going to university and is 1,000 times more meaningful than sitting in lectures. Students are changing. They'll no longer let school govern their lives. As alternatives to traditional higher education become more mainstream, students will look for cheaper and more impactful ways to spend their time. A student may replace an undergraduate degree with an engineering apprenticeship and supplement that with an online course in classics, all the while joining an improv group to develop an interest-based community. Students are realizing that they, too, live in a free world and have the freedom to make independent choices and informed decisions about how, where, when, and why to learn. They will choose what will work best for them and what will provide the most security for their future. And often I think they'll realize that an undergraduate degree and $50,000 in debt is no longer the best option. Education is an investment in yourself. The message that I want to leave you with is this. I'm not talking about hypothetical change that's going to happen in 10 years. This change is happening now. All those companies that I listed, those are real companies. They have millions and millions and millions of dollars in funding. There are dozens more that I didn't mention that you can find at uncollege.org. Right now, I and many other people are working hard all day long, systematically deconstructing the entire system of education. We're taking apart school piece by piece, disaggregating it. Soon, all that's going to be left is an academic ghost town. At uncollege.org, we provide resources for young people to find these to find these sites and companies and ways to educate themselves. We also provide alternative educational experiences and are starting to bring together interest-based communities of people who are working to hack their own education. This summer, we're launching our first Hackademic camp program and bringing together 10 people for a week in San Francisco to learn how to hack their education. If this works, we're going to scale the program, and I'm confident that it will. For 10 spots, we had 140 applications. And starting next year, we're launching an Uncollege Gap Year program to see what it takes to take a cohort of 10 individuals through an entire year-long process of not going to school. Because the only way to provide alternatives is to create an alternative system. You can't take people who've been through 12 years of college and say, or 12 years of school and say, hey, go learn. They'd flounder. These are people who've been through 12 years of school are dependent on extrinsic rewards. They want grades. They want kudos. They want feedback. They want to be told that they're doing well. And so in order to make the transition off of those extrinsic rewards onto intrinsic rewards of peer accountability and self-evaluations, we need to build a system for that transition. Thank you all for allowing me to share stories with you today, and I encourage you to find out more at uncollege.org. If you want to learn more about any of the resources that I talked about, they're all listed there. If you have any questions or thoughts for me, I'd be happy to talk with you later today, either over lunch or over dinner. And you can find my email on the website. It's dale@uncollege.org if there's anything that I missed. Thank you.